Tied to an oak chair by a cartel boss, this trauma nurse didn't beg. She used her body weight to fray her own hemp restraints against a rusted bolt. Her incredible escape demonstrates that panic is just data without structure, and true survival requires the absolute willingness to endure pain to reach clean air. If you're inspired by strong, unbroken women, hit that like button, comment your reaction, and subscribe.
The concrete floor of level B3 always smelled like old grease and wet winter. It was 2:17 in the morning, out on the streets of Chicago. The rain was turning to sleet, but down here it was just cold, a flat, dead kind of cold that got inside your shoes and stayed there. My hand was bleeding, not a lot, just a slow, dark trickle from where my palm had caught the jagged edge of a metal fire door during the rush to get out of the elevator lobby. It smarted, but the sting was a distant thing, compared to the sound echoing through the structural pillars. Thud, 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 heavy leather soles, a man's stride, steady, unhurried. That was the part that made the hairs on my arms stand up, the lack of haste. A man who walks that slowly, after what had just happened on the 42nd floor, is a man who knows exactly how the night is going to end. I squeezed myself smaller into the shadow of a black Lincoln Navigator, pressing my spine against the cold steel of the quarter panel. I held my breath, letting it burn in my lungs as an ear nurse. I knew all about panic. I'd spent 12 years watching people suffocate on their own fear in the triage bays. The first rule of survival they don't teach you in textbooks. Fear makes you loud. It makes your chest heave, makes your jacket rustle. If you want to keep breathing, you have to become a stone. Through the gap between the SUV's tires, I saw him step into the yellow glare of a sodium bulb. Garrett Vance. I didn't know his name then. I only knew him as the man in the charcoal wool coat who, 40 minutes ago, had stood in Dr. Webb's private office and spoken about a man's son a kid away at boarding school with the same casual detachment a person uses to check the weather. Then, I saw the medal. It was lying right there in the oil-slicked driving lane, just 3 feet from my hiding spot. A Colt .45, heavy, customized. It must have slid under the navigator's bumper when Webb's security guy had tried, and failed to draw on Vance's men near the stairwell. Sirens were wailing in the distance, maybe 4 blocks out, heading toward the main entrance on Chicago Avenue. My eyes locked on that gun. The smell of burnt cordite was still clinging to it, sharp and metallic. If the police rolled into this garage and found that weapon sitting out in the open, somebody else was going to die. Maybe a panicked rookie cop. Maybe an innocent night shift janitor caught in the crossfire. It wasn't about logic. It was the same reflex that made me grab rolling gurneys before they hit patients, or cap exposed needles before they stuck a coworker. You don't leave a hazard on the floor, you clear the field. I quired down, my knees scraping the gritty concrete, and reached out. The steel was surprisingly warm. I scooped it up, the weight of it pulling at my wrist, and shoved it deep into the right pocket of my heavy wool coat, right past the loose throat lozenges and my stethoscope. The fabric sagged instantly, the hem dragging against my shin. I didn't even have time to pull my hand back out. A grip like a hydraulic clamp snapped around my wrist. The force of it didn't just stop me. It lifted me. Garrett Vance hauled me out from behind the navigator in one fluid, terrifying motion, pinning my shoulder blades against the passenger door. The air left my lungs in a short, sharp whoosh. He was closer than anyone had been to me in years. He smelled of high-end cedarwood, black coffee, and the bitter frost of the Great Lakes. His eyes weren't dark, they were a pale, piercing gray, the color of the Chicago River just before it freezes over. He didn't look at my face, not at first. His gaze dropped instantly to the right side of my coat, where the heavy square silhouette of the Colt was stretching the wool. He leaned in, his jaw shadowing my cheek. When he spoke, it wasn't a shout. It was a vibration against my ear, low and absolute, mine. The word had a weight to it. It wasn't just about the piece of iron in my pocket. It sounded like a ledger closing. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my chin up, in my line of work. You never let the combative patients see your hands shake. If you look like a victim, people treat you like one. The sirens are at the gate. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice raspy but clear. You walk out of this garage with empty hands, and those federal agents will look right past you. You're a businessman in a nice coat. His gray eyes shifted, finally settling on mine. A slight, dangerous twitch appeared at the corner of his jaw. And you, he murmured. What does that make you? A nurse, I said, holding his gaze. My hands are used to keeping things clean. I've spent a decade hiding the messes people leave behind so nobody else gets hurt. You want your property back. Let S get out of the light first, for a long, heavy second. The only sound was the distant wail of the police cruisers hitting the ramp on B1. Garrett didn't move. He kept his weight pressed against me, measuring me, looking for the lie in my eyes. Then, slowly, the pressure on my wrist eased. He didn't let go, but the stranglehold turned into something else. A guide, a silent agreement. The lavender coat, he said, his voice entirely flat as he looked down at the small flower embroidery near my collar. It's a terrible color for hiding blood. It washes out, I replied. If you know what you're doing. How do you feel about the pacing and the way the dialogue carries the weight here? If you'd like, we can explore how Clara handles the immediate aftermath in the next chapter, as the tension shifts to his territory. The private elevator didn't have buttons. It had a small, brushed steel panel that required Garrett Vance's thumbprint. When the doors slid open on the 54th floor, the air changed. It was thin, too clean. It smelled of expensive air filters and old paper. The penthouse was 4,000 square feet of glass, dark slate, and exposed iron columns. It looked like a museum where someone had forgotten to put out the art. No photographs. No clutter, just rows of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with heavy leather volumes Marcus Aurelius, Machiavelli, and legal textbooks thick enough to stop a bullet. In the corner, near a massive window looking out over the black void of Lake Michigan, sat a Steinway grand piano. A fine layer of dust lay over the closed lid. It looked like a monument to a song that had stopped playing a long time ago. I stood near the entrance, my feet still planted on the slate tiles. My teal scrubs were damp from the rain, and the right pocket of my coat was still sagging with the weight of his Colt .45. Garrett walked past me. He peeled off his charcoal wool coat, tossing it onto a minimalist leather bench without looking. Underneath, his black dress shirt was tailored perfectly. But I noticed the way his right shoulder hitched a sharp, guarded movement. It was a classic mechanical compensation, a rotatory cuff injury, probably less than 48 hours old. He moved behind a long marble island in the kitchen and poured water from a glass pitcher into a heavy tumbler. He slid it across the smooth stone toward me. He didn't invite me to sit. He didn't ask if I was cold. Drink, he said. I looked at the water, then I looked at him. I left the glass right where it was. I don't take drinks from men who think they can dictate when a person breathes, I said. My voice sounded small in the massive, high-ceilinged room, but it didn't shake. I've spent 12 years working the triage desk at Northwestern. I've had gangbangers with gunshot wounds spit blood on my shoes, and city councilmen threaten my license because I wouldn't move them to the front of the line. You don't give up your square foot of dirt to anyone, not even a man who owns the building. Garrett paused, his hand still resting on the marble island. His gray eyes narrowed slightly, studying me with the cold curiosity of a scientist looking at a new slide. It's just water, Clara, he said, his voice a low, level rumble. It's an obligation, I replied. In my world, when you accept something from a man like you, it means you owe him a piece of your autonomy. I don't owe you anything. Every human being is born with an inherent right to self-determination, free and equal. No one gets to be the master of another just because they have a bigger cage. I expected him to get angry. I expected the cold weight of his grip back on my wrist. Instead, Garrett let out a short, dry breath through his nose. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was closer to an admission. He took a slow sip from his own glass, his eyes never leaving mine. An inherent right, he repeated, tasting the words like an old vintage. That's a beautiful sentiment. They teach you that in nursing school. My father taught me that, I said. He was a maintenance man. He spent 40 years fixing things other people broke, and he never once bowed his head to a man who wore a $5,000 suit. Garrett set his glass down. The click of the crystal against the marble was the only sound in the room. Your father was a lucky man if he lived long enough to keep that illusion, Garrett said. He walked around the island, stopping just 2 feet away from me. He was tall enough that the shadow of his chin cut across my throat, but out there, in the streets you just left, equality is a myth invented by people who have never had to fight for a scrap of bread. There are only two kinds of people in this city: those who hold the knife and those who bleed. And you like holding the knife. I don't like it, he said, and for a split second, something raw and exhausted flickered behind his gray eyes. I do it because if I drop it, 500 people who depend on my family for their mortgages and their children's tuition go under. I didn't choose to play God, Clara. I chose to stand in the gap so my people don't get crushed by men who are far worse than me. You're safe here. I don't hurt the innocent. That's the one rule I haven't broken. A rule, I scoffed, reaching into my pocket. My fingers wrapped around the checkered grip of the Colt. I pulled it out and set it on the marble island between us. It looked ugly against the pristine white stone. Like this one. That weapon saved my life tonight because you had the sense to hide it, he said, his gaze dropping to the steel. Which means, whether you like it or not, you've already crossed the line into my world. He pointed toward a hallway to the left. The guest suite is at the end. The door locks from the inside. There is a digital keypad, but I've disabled the remote bypass. If you re-inside, you the only one who can open it. Why? I asked, my hand still hovering near my coat pocket. Why give me a lock if I'm your prisoner? Garrett picked up the Colt, his movements smooth, practiced, and terrifyingly efficient. He checked the chamber, dropped the magazine, and cleared the weapon in 3 seconds. Because a person without security cannot exercise freedom, he said, looking straight into my eyes. If you're terrified every second of the day, your mind isn't free. I need you focused, Clara. Because tomorrow, the people who were trying to kill me tonight are going to start looking for the woman in the lavender coat. He turned on his heel and walked toward his study, leaving me alone with the dust and the silent piano. I went to the guest room. The lock worked exactly like he said it would. The click of the heavy deadbolt felt solid, but it didn't stop the chill from creeping into my bones. I took off my wet coat and hung it over the back of a chair. The room was dark, but the lights from the Chicago skyline bled through the window, casting long, barred shadows across the bed. I didn't sleep. I went into the master bathroom attached to the suite. The space was stone and chrome, sterile as an operating room. I opened the medicine cabinet, expecting to find luxury colognes or sleeping pills. Instead, the shelves were packed with sterile field kits, 40 nylon sutures, scalpel handles, local anesthetic vials, lidocaine gel, numbing patches. It wasn't a vanity case, it was a field hospital disguised as a mirror. My fingers touched a tube of anti-inflammatory gel. I thought about the hitch in Garrett's right shoulder, the way his muscles had bunched beneath his shirt when he lifted me. At 6:00 a.m., the first gray light of dawn began to crack over the lake. The rain had stopped, leaving the glass streaked with dirty soot. I unlocked my door and walked out into the living area. The penthouse was quiet. A faint smell of dark roast coffee floated from the kitchen. Garrett was there. He had changed into a clean black shirt, but his jacket was off. He was leaning against the counter, trying to reach around his back to apply a medical patch to his right shoulder blade. His fingers couldn't quite reach the spot. His face was pale. His jaw clenched tight against the pain. He heard my footsteps and froze, his arm dropping to his side. He tried to straighten up, to put the mask back on, but the micro-expression of agony was already documented by my eyes. I didn't ask for permission. I walked over to the counter, picked up the medicated patch he had dropped, and peeled off the plastic backing. "Stand still," I said. "I can manage." He growled, his voice rough from sleep. "You can't," I said, my voice dropping into the firm, no-nonsense tone I used with difficult patients in room 4. "You have a grade 2 tear in your rotator cuff, Mr. Vance. If you keep overcompensating like that, you're going to freeze the joint completely. Human biology doesn't care about your pride. If you break the machinery, it stops working." He didn't move. His back was broad, mapping a landscape of old tension. I placed my left hand flat against his left shoulder to stabilize him, and with my right, I pressed the cold, medicated patch firmly against the torn muscle group beneath his shoulder blade. His skin was hot, under my palm. I felt his pulse rate elevated, around 90 beats a minute. But as the medicine began to seep into the tissue, I felt the tight coil of his muscles slowly give way. "You have soft hands for someone who handles so much blood," he muttered. His back still turned to me. "That's because I use them to heal. Not to take," I said. I smoothed down the edges of the adhesive tape. "Every person's body is a temple of dignity, Garrett. It is the only thing we truly own from the day we reborn to the day we die. When you abuse it, or let others abuse it, you giving away the only piece of sacred ground you have left." He didn't answer. He stood there for a long moment, letting the warmth of my hand linger on his back. Then, the encrypted phone on the counter began to vibrate. Garrett stepped away from me, the distance between us opening up like a canyon. He picked up the device. The screen lit up with a video file. He tapped it. The video showed a crowded courtyard at DePaul University. The camera zoomed in on a young girl with dark curls, a green backpack, and a stack of textbooks clutched to her chest. She was laughing at something a classmate had said, completely oblivious to the world around her. It was Chloe, my little sister. Beneath the video, a single text line appeared. "The lavender coat has a sister. Bring the ledger to the Southside rail yard by midnight, or we give her a new coat." The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. The marble floor felt like it was tilting beneath my feet. I reached out, my fingers catching the edge of the island to keep from falling. Garrett looked at the screen, his face turning into something carved from granite. He didn't look at me. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just watched the loop of my sister laughing in the sun, his eyes turning as gray and dead as the winter lake. "No," I said. The word came out as a whisper, then rose into a sharp, jagged cry. "No, no, no." I lunged for the phone, my fingers clawing at the glass screen. But Garrett's arm came down like an iron bar, blocking me. He didn't shove me. He just anchored his weight, absorbing my panic as I struck his chest with my fists. "Let me go," I screamed. The professional restraint I'd spent 12 years building, vanishing into pure, animal terror. "That's my sister. She's 19, Garrett. She doesn't even know what your company does. She thinks I'm working an extra shift. Clara, look at me," he commanded. He grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging into my scrubs. He forced me back until my hips hit the marble island. "Look at me," he barked. I looked up. My vision was blurred with tears, but his face was completely clear. There was no panic in him, no hesitation, just a terrible, calculated stillness. "If you run out of this building right now," he said, his voice dropping into a harsh, steady rhythm, "you will die before you reach the red line station. And your sister will die 10 minutes later. Victor doesn't take hostages to negotiate with nurses. He takes them to pull me into the open." "Then go into the open," I yelled, a tear sliding down my nose. "Take your guns, take your money. Take whatever disgusting ledger they're talking about and give it to him. She isn't an innocent kid. She has a right to be safe from your filth." Garrett didn't flinch. He let go of my shoulders, but he stayed close, his breath warm against my cold forehead. "Every human life has value, Clara," he said, his voice shockingly quiet, verbalizing the very logic I lived by, but twisting it into something darker. "I know that. But if I hand Victor that ledger, he gets the names of every federal informant, every dirty judge, and every legitimate business owner who has ever helped me keep the peace in this city. Within 48 hours, there will be 30 bodies in the Chicago River. The gang wars from the 90s will look like a playground dispute. I cannot trade 30 lives for one. The math doesn't work." "She's not math," I screamed, my voice cracking. "She's my sister." "I know," he said. He turned his back to me, walking over to the massive window. The morning sun was hitting the glass now, throwing his long shadow across the hardwood floor. "I had a brother once. His name was Samuel." I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my breathing ragged. "What happened to him? My father used him," Garrett said, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the water met the sky. "Our father was an uncomplicated man. He believed that loyalty was something you beat into a boy until his spirit broke. When I was 17, I tried to take Samuel and run. We got as far as the bus terminal in Gary, Indiana." He stopped. His right hand went to his shoulder, his thumb tracing the edge of the medicated patch I had applied 20 minutes ago. My father's men found us, Garrett continued, his voice entirely flat. A narrative stripped of all emotion, because the emotion had been burned out decades ago. They brought us back to the basement in Pilsen. My father made me watch while he broke Samuel's legs with a iron tire iron. He told me that a family is a chain, and if one link tries to pull away, the whole structure has to suffer to restore balance. Samuel never walked without a cane after that. 2 years later, he took a handful of sleeping pills because he couldn't stand the sound of his own bones clicking when it rained. The anger in my chest didn't disappear, but the shape of it changed. It turned into a heavy, cold stone that sat on my ribs. I looked at the long, hidden scars beneath his black shirt. "Is that why you took his place?" I asked, my voice trembling, to become the man with the tire iron. Garrett turned around. The sun was behind him now, casting his face in deep shadow. "I took his place so I could bury him," Garrett said. "And then I spent 10 years ensuring that nobody else's younger brother had to sit in a basement and listen to the sound of metal hitting bone. I don't expect you to understand my choices, Clara. But don't you ever think I don't know the cost of what I do." He walked back to the kitchen island, picked up his phone, and tapped a speed dial number. "Marcus," Garrett said into the receiver. "We have a code 7, the girl from DePaul. Move the north side detail in, secure the perimeter of her dorm. Do not engage unless they try to move her into a vehicle. I want eyes on her every second until I get there." He hung up and looked at me. "My men are professionals," he said. "They will keep her alive until midnight. But we have 6 hours to find another way to break Victor's leverage." "How?" I asked, stepping closer to him. "You said you won't give him the ledger." "I won't," Garrett said. "But I can give him something he wants more than information." "What?" "Me," he said simply. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens in the trauma room, right after the monitor goes flat, the collective intake of breath, before the real work begins. I looked at him, this man, who had spent his entire life building an empire of iron and shadow just to keep his world from collapsing. He was 41 years old, but in the harsh morning light, he looked like he had lived 3 lifetimes. "That's suicide," I said. "It's a calculation," he corrected, walking toward his bedroom to fetch his coat. "In a war, you don't defend every inch of dirt. You wait for the enemy to overextend their line, and then you strike the head. Victor thinks I'm weak because I have a rule about the innocent. He thinks you're my vulnerability." He stopped at the doorway, turning his head to look back at me. "He doesn't know that a woman who spent 12 years saving lives in the poorest ER in the city doesn't break easily," Garrett said. "Get your coat. Clara, we going to see a doctor." "A doctor?" I asked, my hand automatically going to the empty pocket where the Colt had been. "Why? Because Dr. Webb isn't just your chief of medicine," Garrett said, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous spark. "He is the man who gave Victor the photos of your sister, and at time he explained exactly how much his own skin is worth." As we walked back to the private elevator, I felt the small flower embroidery on my lavender coat rub against my wrist. The fabric was still damp, but the weight of the night was gone. We were moving now. And for the first time since 2:17 a.m., I realized I wasn't just surviving his world, I was helping him rewrite the rules. The Cadillac Escalade handled the slush on Michigan Avenue with a heavy, mechanical rumble. Garrett drove. His hands were loose on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, but his gray eyes never stayed in one place for more than a second. They flicked from the rearview mirror to the side glass, scanning the delivery vans, the yellow cabs, the city buses. I sat in the passenger seat. My fingers knotted so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were the color of chalk. The adrenaline from the phone call had faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in my belly. The human heart can only maintain maximum output for about 20 minutes before the tissue begins to suffer from lactic acid buildup. I said into the quiet of the cabin. My voice sounded flat, even to me. "That's what panic does. It's an evolutionary design meant to save you from a tiger. But when the tiger is 6 hours away, the body just cooks itself from the inside." Garrett didn't look at me. He swung the massive SUV left onto Huron Street, the tires crunching over gray patches of frozen salt. "Then let it cool," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic cadence that matched the thump of the windshield wipers. "Panic is just data without structure. You re-looking at the whole mountain. Clara, don't do that. Just look at the next 10 feet of road. Easy for you to say, I muttered. Looking out at the pedestrians, hurrying into coffee shops, their heads tucked against the wind. They looked so normal, so safe. She's my baby sister, Garrett. I changed her diapers, I taught her how to drive, when our mother died. I promised her that nothing I am bad would ever touch her. Garrett pulled the vehicle into an alleyway behind a brick medical pavilion. The sign above the steel security door read Staff, Private Parking. He kept the engine running, the vibrations humming through the floorboards. A promise like that is a beautiful lie, he said softly. He turned his head, his pale gray eyes fixing on mine. Nobody can keep the world from touching the people they love. The only thing you can do, the only moral duty you actually have, is to give them the tools to survive the impact when it happens. If you shelter a person from every cold wind, you don't protect them. You just ensure they freeze to death the first time the fire goes out. I closed my eyes for a second, letting his words sit in the dark of my mind. It was a harsh philosophy, but it had the clean weight of truth. In the emergency room, the families who collapsed into the loudest hysterics were always the ones who had never seen a bandage. The ones who lived through things, the ones who knew what a scar looked like, they were the ones who held the basin while we worked. Webb is on the third floor, I said, opening my eyes. His private practice clinic doesn't open until 9. He'll be alone, setting up his charts. Good, Garrett said. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a spare magazine for his Colt, and slid it into his pocket with a dry, metallic click. Let's go have a consultation. The service elevator was slow, smelling of floor wax and old coffee. When the bell dinged on 3, the corridor was completely silent. The carpeted hallway muffled our footsteps. I led the way, my plastic hospital badge dangling from my neck, a familiar weight that suddenly felt like an artifact from a different life. The gold lettering on the glass door read, Marcus Webb, MD, Chief of Internal Medicine. I pushed the door open. The waiting room was dim. The leather chairs empty, the aquarium in the corner humming a steady, watery rhythm. From the back office, a sliver of bright halogen light spilled across the carpet. We walked in without knocking. Dr. Webb was sitting at his mahogany desk, a dictation microphone in his hand, a white lab coat draped over his shoulders. He looked every bit the distinguished physician's silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a pristine tan from a recent trip to Scottsdale. But when his eyes lifted from his charts and saw Garrett Vance standing in the doorway, the color left his face so fast it looked like a clinical shock. The dictation microphone slid from his fingers, hitting the blotter with a soft thud. Garrett, Webb stammered, his hands automatically rising an inch above the desk. I didn't expect you until the board meeting on Thursday. Garrett didn't answer. He walked into the room with that slow, unhurried stride I learned to fear in the garage. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He just closed the heavy oak door behind us and turned the deadbolt with a quiet, deliberate twist. Marcus, Garrett said, his voice almost conversational. He sat down in one of the leather visitor chairs, leaning back and crossing one leg over the other. You look pale. Clara, what's the clinical term for a man whose blood vessels constrict because he knows he's been caught? Vasoconstriction, I said, my voice steadying as the nurse in me took over the room. The sympathetic nervous system takes over. It pulls all the blood away from the skin and sends it to the major muscle groups because the brain thinks it needs to run or fight. But if you have an underlying cardiac condition, that sudden spike in peripheral resistance can cause an ischemic event, a heart attack. Dr. Webb. Webb looked from me to Garrett, his lips trembling. Clara, what are you doing with him? You're an employee of this hospital. You have an obligation to standard protocol. My only protocol today is keeping my sister alive, I said, stepping up to the edge of his desk. I leaned down, my hands flat on the polished wood. You gave Victor the photos of Chloe. You gave him her schedule at DePaul. Why, I didn't have a choice, Webb burst out, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic register. He looked at Garrett, his eyes wide with terror. Victor's men, they came to my house in Hinsdale on Monday night. They had photos of my son at Exeter. They knew his dorm number, Garrett. They said if I didn't give them the medical ledgers, the ones detailing the private consultations for your financial directors, they'd send him back to me in a box. Garrett didn't move an inch. He sat in the shadow of the corner, his face unreadable. So you gave them my people's records, Garrett said, his tone perfectly flat, and when that wasn't enough to buy your peace, you gave them Clara's sister. They knew she worked the night shift, Webb pleaded, tears finally leaking over his wire-rimmed glasses. They knew she was the one who logged the trauma intakes outside the city grid. They told me if I didn't give them a lever to force you into a meeting, they'd kill my boy anyway. I was protecting my son, Garrett. A father has a right to protect his own blood. A father has a right to try, Garrett said softly. He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the light from the office window. He walked over to the desk, picked up a silver reflex hammer from a tray, and turned it over in his hand. But true authority doesn't come from sacrificing someone else's child to save your own, Marcus. That's not protection. That's just a transaction. And in my world, once you start trading lives to buy your safety, you discover that the price goes up every single day until you have nothing left to sell. Garrett set the reflex hammer down on the desk with a sharp, heavy clack. Where is Victor holding the meeting? Garrett asked. The South Side rail yards, Webb whispered, his head dropping into his hands. Track 14, the old grain silo, midnight. He told me to tell you that if you don't bring the physical encryption keys for the port logistics ledger, he will start with the girl's fingers. Garrett looked down at the weeping doctor for a long moment. There was no pity in his face, but there was no anger either. It was just the look of a man looking at a broken piece of equipment that could no longer be used. Stay in this office, Marcus, Garrett said. Don't call your wife. Don't call your lawyer. If you touch that phone before midnight, I let Victor's men know that you've been talking to me. And we both know how he treats a broken contract. We left the office, the door clicking shut behind us. In the elevator on the way back down, I looked at Garrett's profile in the mirror. His jaw was set, the muscles in his neck tight against his collar. He was terrified, I said quietly. He's an old man who wanted to save his kid. I know, Garrett said, his eyes meeting mine in the glass reflection. But fear is an explanation, Clara. It's never an excuse. If we let fear dictate our ethics, then the wolves win every single time. We have 14 hours before midnight. We need to go see my brother. Danny Vance lived in a small, rented bungalow in Bridgeport, 3 blocks from the old Comiskey Park site. The neighborhood was old Chicago brick 2-flats, chain-link fences, and American flags hanging from front porches. It was a world away from the glass towers of the Loop, and a universe away from the blood-slicked concrete of level B3. Danny was 26, a history teacher at a local public high school. He had Garrett's gray eyes, but the rest of his face was softer, rounder, untouched by the kind of calculations that kept his older brother awake at night. When he opened the front door, he was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and holding a red grading pen. He looked at Garrett, then at me, his brow furrowing. Garrett, Danny said, stepping back to let us into the small, warm living room. The air smelled of old books and cinnamon toast. What's going on? You haven't been here in 6 months. Who's your friend? This is Clara, Garrett said, closing the door and locking it. He didn't take off his coat. He stood in the center of the small room like an iron pillar, in a dollhouse. She's a nurse, and we have a problem. Danny set his pen down on a coffee table cluttered with student essays. He looked at Garrett's rigid posture, then at the way my hands were shaking as I stood near the radiator. Is it Victor? Danny asked, his voice dropping an octave. Did he break the treaty? He has Clara's sister, Garrett said. He wants the port logistics keys. He wants the whole Midwest line, Danny. Danny let out a long, low whistle, running a hand through his sandy hair. Hans sat down on the edge of the sofa, looking up at his brother with a mix of frustration and ancient, familiar weariness. I told you to get out 3 years ago, Danny said, his voice rising slightly, after the docs went quiet. I told you to hand the keys to the feds and walk away. I've got enough legitimate real estate to live 3 lifetimes. Garrett. Why are you still holding on to the shadow? Because if I walk away without a transition plan, the vacuum will bring a war that hits every neighborhood from here to Gary, Garrett said, his voice dropping into that low, heavy rhythm. He stepped toward his younger brother, his shadow falling across the cluttered coffee table. True responsibility means you don't just dump the trash on your neighbor's lawn because you're tired of carrying it. You finish the job. You close the accounts. And while you're closing accounts, an innocent 19-year-old girl is sitting in a cage, Danny shouted, standing up to face him. He was shorter than Garrett, but he had the same stubborn set to his jaw. Look at her, Garrett. Look at what your world does to people who don't even know who you are. He pointed at me. I stood there, the heat from the radiator pressing against the back of my legs. But my insides were still ice. I looked at the two brothers, the one who had taken the blows, and the one who had been shielded from them. Danny, I said, my voice cutting through their argument. Your brother says he did all this to keep you out of the dark. He says your father. He says what happened to Samuel was the reason he stayed. Danny froze. He looked at me, then at Garrett, a sudden, complicated look of pain and resentment crossing his features. Samuel, Danny whispered, his voice turning bitter. He sat back down, his shoulders slumping. Garrett loves that story. He loves playing the martyr who stayed in the mud so I could walk on the sidewalk. It's not a story, Danny, Garrett said, his voice cracking slightly for the first time all day. I watched him break his legs. I know you did. Danny snapped back, looking up with hot, angry eyes. But you didn't see what happened after Samuel died, Garrett. You were too busy taking over the executive suites. You were too busy learning how to look like a CEO. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and extracted a small, faded Polaroid photo. He didn't give it to Garrett. He walked across the room and handed it directly to me. Look at the date on the back, Clara, Danny said. I turned the small square of plastic over. In faded blue ink, a hand had written, September 14, 2025, Pilsen Warehouse. I turned it back over. The photo showed Garrett Vance. He was younger, his hair completely black, standing next to Victor Sorokin. They were both smiling, holding crystal glasses outside a brick warehouse, the exact warehouse where my father had worked as a maintenance man before his accident 3 months ago. The room seemed to lose its oxygen. The sound of the radiator turned into a loud, metallic roar in my ears. My father died 3 months ago, I said, my voice barely a breath as I stared at the photo. I looked up at Garrett, my vision blurring with a sudden violent rush of heat. He was a maintenance man at that warehouse. He found a surveillance tap in the basement wall. He told me he was going to take it to the police on a Monday morning. On Sunday night, a hit-and-run driver took his life on 18th Street. Garrett didn't move. He stood beneath the ceiling light, his face pale, his gray eyes locked on the small photo in my hand. Clara, he said, his voice dropping into a low, desperate register I hadn't heard before. I bought that property 6 months before your father died. I needed the logistics hub to reroute the supply lines away from Victor's people. And my father found your taps, I screamed, the photo fluttering from my fingers onto the rug. I stepped toward him, my chest heaving, the sheer weight of the betrayal crushing the last bit of reserve I had left. You told me you didn't hurt the innocent. You told me that was your line. Did you kill him? Did you order some guy in a dark sedan to erase an old man because he was going to ruin your beautiful transition plan? No, Garrett said. He didn't reach for me this time. He stayed perfectly still, accepting my rage like a man standing in a downpour. I didn't order it. I didn't know your father's name until 3 weeks after the funeral, when the audit report hit my desk. But you knew he was dead, I yelled, my voice breaking into a sob. You knew why he died. And you kept the building. You kept using the lines that were bought with his blood. Because giving up the building wouldn't bring him back. Garrett roared, his voice finally exploding through the quiet room. Rattling the teacups on the sideboard, he stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. In my world, Clara, when a mistake happens, when a tragedy occurs, because two empires are rubbing against each other, you don't run away and cry about the injustice. You take the ground. You secure the asset so that the people who actually pulled the trigger don't get to profit from the death. I didn't kill your father. But if I hadn't consolidated that warehouse, Victor would have taken it, and he would have used it to bring 3 tons of fentanyl into the South Side every single week. That's the choice. That's the real world. I looked at him, my heart breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. He wasn't a monster. He was something worse, a man who had turned his own conscience into a spreadsheet, weighing lives against logistics until the human cost was just a decimal point in a ledger. "You're a liar," I whispered, my tears cold on my cheeks. "You're just like your father. You just wear a better suit." I turned on my heel and walked out of the bungalow. Garrett didn't follow me. He didn't call my name. Through the glass of the front door, I saw him stand in the center of Danny's living room, his head bowed, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his charcoal coat, a man completely alone in the kingdom of ice he had built for himself. The Chicago wind hit me like a slap as I reached the sidewalk. The sleet was starting again, small hard grains of ice stinging my face as I began to run toward the Red Line station, my mind screaming with a single terrifying thought. I have 8 hours to save my sister, and I am completely on my own. The Red Line train rattled over the elevated tracks of the south side, its steel wheels shrieking against the frozen curves. I sat with my forehead pressed against the scratched, grime-smeared glass of the window. The sleet was coming down hard now. It blurred the neon signs of the check-cashing joints and liquor stores below into long, weeping smears of red and yellow. My phone's dead. The battery had given up somewhere near Chinatown, its screen going black like an eye closing. I didn't care. There was nobody left to call anyway. I got off at the 47th Street station. The platform was empty, smelling of wet wool, damp concrete, and the bitter metal tang of the third rail. I walked down the stairs into the wind. Each step felt heavy, like my shoes were lined with lead. The professional armor I'd worn for 12 years, the crisp teal scrubs, the calm voice, the clinical detachment, it was all gone. I was just a woman in a damp lavender coat, walking through a neighborhood that didn't care if I lived or died. I went to the hospital, not to work. I went because it was the only place left where the rules made sense. The ER lobby at Northwestern Memorial was a zoo. A 6-car pileup on the Dan Ryan had sent a wave of lacerations and broken bones through the doors, and the triage desk was drowning. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt, cheap bleach, and the low, collective groan of 30 people waiting for a doctor. I didn't log in. I didn't go to the staff locker room. I just stood near the vending machines in the hallway, watching my coworkers move. They looked like dancers in a ballet I used to know by heart. Pressure, packing, elevation, check the vitals, move to the next bay. It was simple. It was clean. You saw a hole, you plugged it. You didn't weigh the moral logistics of the warehouse where the patient got shot. You just kept the pump moving. "Clara," I turned. James was standing there, holding a clipboard and 3 vials of typed blood. He was 28. A floating nurse who usually worked the pediatric overflow. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot, his lower lip raw where he'd been chewing on it. "James," I said, my voice sounding thin under the fluorescent lights. "What are you doing over here?" He didn't answer right away. He looked around the chaotic hallway, his fingers tightening on the edge of the clipboard until the plastic cracked. He stepped closer to me, his breath smelling of stale peppermint and pure panic. "You shouldn't be here, Clara," he whispered. His voice was trembling so hard I could hear his teeth click. "They came to my apartment this morning. 2 men, Russians. They knew about my brother S. debt with the sports book on 26th Street. They said if I didn't give them your address, they'd collect the 40 grand from his skin." The world didn't tilt this time. It just went completely silent, the way the trauma room does, right before you apply the paddles. "James," I said softly, my voice dropping into that rhythmic, steady cadence. "Look at me." He looked up, a tear cutting a clean track through the grime on his cheek. "Fear is an infectious agent, James," I said, stating the clinical truth like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "It spreads faster than any virus, and once it gets into your bloodstream, it destroys your ability to see the line between right and wrong. When you sacrifice another person's safety to protect your own skin, you don't actually stop the infection, you just become a carrier." "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his head dropping against the vending machine. "I'm so sorry, Clara. They have Chloe. They told me to give you this if you showed up." He shoved a small piece of paper into my hand. It was a standard hospital inventory tag, the kind we loop around a patient's wrist when they readmitted without ID. Written on the cardboard back in heavy black marker was an address. Track 14, Grain Silo. Southside Yards, bring the keys. 1 hour. I looked at the tag, then I looked at James. He was a good kid who had been broken by an iron wheel he didn't even know existed. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a profound, exhausting pity. Go back to work, James, I said, tucking the tag into my pocket. Go scrub your hands. Use the hot water. I turned away from the desk and walked toward the exit doors. As I reached the sliding glass, I saw a sedan with tinted windows idling by the ambulance bay. The exhaust was a thick gray cloud in the frozen air. A man in a dark track jacket was sitting in the driver's seat, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't looking at the ambulances. He was looking at me. I could have run back into the hospital. I could have triggered the security alarm, called the police, hidden in the basement vaults where they keep the radioactive isotopes. But I looked back at the triage lobby at the pregnant women. The old men clutching their chests, the kids with high fevers. Bowel look is like water, it always finds the lowest point. And if you don't give it an exit, it pools until it drowns everyone in the room. I wouldn't let that water touch this place. I wouldn't let Garrett S. Shadow or Victor S. Knife ruin the only sacred ground I had left. I pushed the glass doors open, stepped out into the freezing sleet, and walked straight toward the sedan. The back door clicked open before I even reached the curb. I didn't look inside, I just climbed onto the vinyl seat, the door slamming shut behind me with a heavy final thud. The child locks clicked into place instantly. The driver didn't say a word. He pulled out into the traffic on Huron Street, the tires spinning for a fraction of a second on the slush, before gripping the asphalt and heading south. I sat in the back, my hands resting flat on my knees. My coat pocket was empty. I didn't have his Colt .45. I didn't have the encryption keys. I had nothing but 12 years of ER experience and the small flower embroidery near my collar. But as the city lights began to thin out, replaced by the dark, skeletal shapes of industrial cranes and abandoned warehouses along the canal, I realized something. Garrett had been right about one thing. A person without security cannot exercise freedom. But he had the definition wrong. Security wasn't a lock on a door or an army of men with guns. Security was knowing exactly what you were willing to die for. And for the first time all night, my mind was perfectly clear. The grain silo at track 14 was a concrete cylinder that rose 80 feet into the black sky like a hollow tooth. Inside, the air was dead. It smelled of 80 years of rotted wheat, damp iron, and the sharp, sour tang of chemical fertilizer. A single halogen construction lamp hung from a rusted rebar hook in the center of the ceiling, casting a harsh, conical glare down onto the dirt floor. They had tied me to a heavy oak chair. The rope was old-fashioned hemp, thick and rough, smelling of river water. It bit into my wrists every time I shifted my weight. I didn't struggle. Every nurse who has ever worked a psychiatric hold knows that when a patient is in a high-velocity manic episode, struggling against the restraints only increases the trauma response. The body pumps more cortisol. The heart rate spikes. You lose your peripheral vision. If you want to survive a restraint, you have to let your muscles go slack. You have to find the loose millimeter in the knot and stay there. Victor Sorokin sat across from me on an upturned plastic milk crate. He didn't look like a movie villain. He looked like a retired Union bricklayer from Northwest Indiana, short, thick-necked, wearing a faded navy windbreaker and a pair of sensible orthopedic New Balance sneakers. He was peeling an orange with a small silver pocket knife, his stubby fingers moving with a slow, meticulous precision. He popped a slice of fruit into his mouth, chewed deliberately, and looked at me through his thick, gold-rimmed bifocals. "You have the Vance chin, Clara," he said, his English carrying the flat, nasal vowels of the South Side streets, not by blood, of course, but by proximity. Garrett S. people all get that look after a while, like they waiting for a train that S already 3 hours late. "I don't belong to Garrett," I said. My voice echoed flatly against the circular concrete walls, and I don't have his keys. Victor let out a short, wet chuckle, using the blade of his knife to scrape a piece of white pith from beneath his thumbnail. "Garrett thinks he is a philosopher," Victor said, shaking his head. "He thinks if he writes enough numbers in a ledger, He can turn blood into interest rates. He talks about treaties, about transitions, about the stability of the market. But a market is just a name we give to the fear of starving. When you strip away the suits and the private elevators, there is only one transaction that matters. Who is willing to pull the trigger first? He leaned forward, the smell of citrus and old tobacco hitting my face. He won't pull it for you, Clara, Victor murmured. He didn't pull it for his brother Samuel. He didn't pull it for your father. He is a bookkeeper. He knows the cost of the inventory is too high. My father died because of you, I said. My wrists were cold against the hemp rope, but my voice was a flat line. He found your taps in the Pilsen building. You killed an old man who spent his life fixing boilers because you wanted a piece of a shipping dock. Victor stopped scraping his thumb. He looked at me through the top half of his bifocals, his face turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated boredom. Your father was 68 years old, Clara, Victor said, his tone entirely casual. He had a leaky valve in his heart and $3,000 in his checking account. In the grand ledger of this city, he didn't exist. He was a zero. If a zero gets in the way of a $3 million logistics corridor, the zero gets erased. That S not malice. That S just infrastructure. I looked at him, at his small knife, his sensible shoes, his complete lack of human feeling. He was right about the infrastructure. This city was built on it. The concrete beneath our feet was mixed with the bones of people who had been cleared out to make room for the rail lines, the stockyards, the highways. But as I looked at him, the fear in my stomach didn't come back. It was replaced by a strange cold clarity. Every human being has an inherent dignity. Victor, I said, my voice dropping into that rhythmic, low cadence I used when a patient was slipping away on the gurney. It does to matter if they have $3 or 3 million. You cannot turn a person into a zero just because you have the power to erase them. The universe doesn't forget the math. Every time you take a life, you leave a hole in the fabric of the world, and eventually, the whole structure collapses into the void you created. Victor stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then he let out a loud bark of a laugh, tossing the orange peel into the dirt. "A nurse," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "A nurse with a sermon. I love this city. You can find everything here." He walked toward the heavy steel slider door at the back of the silo. "Keep her quiet," he told the two men standing in the shadows near the entrance. Vance's SUV just hit the perimeter sensor on 51st Street. He is 40 minutes early. He must have skipped the expressway. The steel door groaned shut behind him, the heavy iron latch dropping into place with a definitive thunk. The silo went dim, the only light coming from the single halogen bulb overhead. The two guards didn't look at me. They were young kids, 20 or 21. Wearing oversized hoodies and heavy work boots, they stood by the door, passing a vape pen back and forth, their eyes fixed on the small glowing screens of their phones. I waited until their breathing settled into a steady, rhythmic pattern. My wrists were numb. I couldn't feel my fingers, but I could feel the structure of the chair. It was old oak, held together by iron bolts that had rusted over decades of dampness. The wood near my right hip was split along, jagged fissure where the grain had given way under the weight of some old machinery. I began to work. I didn't pull against the ropes. I used the counterpressure of my thigh muscle against the oak leg to create a lever. Every time the guards took a breath, every time a train rumbled on the main line outside, I shifted my weight 2 millimeters to the left, pressing the rough hemp twine against the sharp, splintered edge of the split oak. Fray, fray, fray. It was a slow, microscopic process. In the emergency room, we call it debridement the slow. Careful removal of dead tissue to expose the healthy skin beneath. It takes patience. It takes an absolute willingness to endure the sting of the friction if you want to reach the clean air. By 11:45, I felt the first strand of the hemp give way with a tiny, distinct pop against my hip. The loop around my waist slacked by 1/8 of an inch. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes fixed on the halogen bulb, my mind counting the seconds, my body moving with the steady, invisible rhythm of a machine. Then, from the dark hallway behind the concrete wall to my right, I heard a sound. It wasn't a footstep, it was a soft, wet cough, a kid-esque cough, Chloe. She was in the secondary storage bin, less than 10 feet away from me. separated only by a sheet of rusted corrugated iron. She was alive. She was breathing. The loose strand of rope slipped over my wrist, the rough fibers scraping away the top layer of skin until the blood began to run down my palm. I didn't flinch, I didn't make a sound. I just reached down through the slack, my slick, bleeding fingers finding the heavy iron bolt at the base of the chair leg. Outside, the first high, screaming wail of a vehicle's brakes echoed through the rail yard. Garrett Vance had arrived, and the midnight ledger was finally open. The heavy steel slider door didn't open all the way. It caught on a rusted track, giving up with a sharp, metallic screech that rattled the concrete walls of the silo. Through the gap, the midnight air rushed in. It brought the smell of frozen diesel, wet gravel, and the immense, flat emptiness of the south side rail yards. Then came the headlamps, too bright. White beams of xenon light cut through the dark, turning the dust motes inside the silo into a cloud of silver moths. Garrett's Escalade didn't park. It rolled straight into the center of the yard, the engine idling with a low, hydraulic throb that made the dirt floor vibrate beneath my boots. The two young guards near the door straightened up, their vape pens disappearing into their hoodies. They reached under their jackets, their shoulders tightening as they gripped the handles of whatever steel they were carrying. They were looking at the headlights. They were looking at the bright, blinding glare. That was their first mistake. In an emergency, the human eye always tracks the brightest light source. It's an evolutionary reflex. But any veteran triage nurse can tell you that the thing that kills you is never the guy yelling in the center of the lobby. It's us, the quiet one, slipping through the side door while everyone else is distracted. I felt the rope around my right wrist slacken another inch. The blood from my scraped palm made the hemp slick, allowing me to slide my thumb through the center of the knot. My hand was free. I left it in my lap, keeping my shoulders slumped, letting them think the oak chair was still doing the work. Victor Sorokin stepped out from the shadow of a rusted hopper car, his pocket knife gone, his hands shoved deep into his navy windbreaker. He didn't look at me. He looked at the driver's side door of the Escalade as it clicked open. Garrett stepped down into the slush. He wasn't wearing his charcoal manteau anymore, just a plain black wool sweater, dark jeans, and his leather work boots. He looked smaller out here in the wind, stripped of the executive office and the glass towers. He looked like a man who had come to shovel the driveway. He carried a small, heavy aluminum briefcases in his left hand. His right arm hung loose at his side, the fingers twitching slightly against his thigh right where his Colt .45 usually rested. "You're early, Garrett," Victor said, his voice carrying easily over the throb of the engine. "A businessman should know that punctuality shows hunger, and hunger makes you sloppy." "I'm not hungry, Victor," Garrett said, his voice a low, steady cadence that didn't carry an ounce of sweat. He walked to the front of the vehicle, stopping 10 feet away from the older trum. "I am just efficient. The keys for the port logistics grid are in the case. Let the girl go, and we close the ledger." Victor let out that wet, rattling chuckle. He signaled to the guard on his left. The kid reached back, grabbing a handful of my hair, and jerked my head back to expose my throat to the light. I didn't scream. I just kept my eyes fixed on Garrett. "The girl is fine," Victor said, nodding toward me. "But we have a new line item, Garrett. The doctor on Huron Street. He talked to you before you left, didn't he? He told you about his son." Garrett didn't flinch. He set the aluminum case down on the hood of the Escalade, his movement smooth, rhythmic, and perfectly controlled despite the blood I knew was drying under his shirt from his torn shoulder. "Webb is a civilian, Victor," Garrett said, his tone dropping into that cold, lecture-like clarity. "When you drag a man's family into a corporate dispute, you aren't showing power. You're showing bankruptcy. A contract is only valid when both parties have the security to honor it. If you strip away a man's basic safety, you destroy his incentive to keep his word. You don't get loyalty that way. You just get an informant waiting for the right phone call. I don't need his loyalty." Victor spat, his voice losing its casual Union bricklayer tone for the first time. He took a step forward, his stubby fingers flexing inside his pockets. "I need the grid. I need the South Side lines. Garrett, your father understood that. He knew that if you don't take the whole street, Somebody else will build a track right over your back. My father is dead, Garrett said, and the track he built ended in a basement in Pilsen. I am not signing over the Port Authority deeds. Victor, the case contains the encryption keys for the existing inventory. That's the offer, take it. Or we find out exactly how much blood this concrete can absorb, before the feds shut down the whole yard. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of cold, breathless silence that happens right before a storm snaps a power line. Then, from the dark shadow behind the Escalade's rear tire, a third man stepped into the light. He was older, wearing a grease-stained Mechanic S jacket. He had a short-barreled shotgun tucked against his ribs, and he was moving toward Garrett S. right flank, Garrett S. blind spot. Garrett didn't see him. He was looking at Victor, his focus locked on the center of the line. He didn't know that his torn rotator cuff made it impossible for him to swing his right arm fast enough to clear a target coming from that angle. My heart hit my ribs like a hammer, but the nurse in my brain took over. Panic is just data without structure. Look at the next 10 feet of road. I pulled my right hand completely out of the hemp knot. My fingers wrapped around the heavy iron bolt I'd been working loose at the base of the chair leg. It was 8 inches of rusted, jagged metal, heavy as a tire iron. I didn't think about the legality of it. I didn't think about the nursing board or the oath I'd taken to do no harm. You don't leave a hazard on the floor. You clear the field. I stood up, the heavy oak chair clattering backward into the dirt. The young guard holding my hair let out a grunt of surprise as the sudden movement pulled him off balance. Before he could draw his weapon, I swung my right arm with every ounce of leverage my 12-hour shifts had given my shoulders. The iron bolt caught the guard right in the meat of his forearm. I heard the sharp, wet crack of the radius bone giving way. He dropped his gun into the dirt, screaming, clutching his arm to his chest. "Garrett!" I yelled, my voice tearing through the concrete silo. Right flank, low, the shout was enough. Garrett didn't turn his head, he didn't have the time. Instead, he dropped his weight, throwing his shoulder into a hard, defensive roll across the hood of the Cadillac just as the mechanic in the grease-stained jacket pulled the trigger. Boom! The shotgun blast tore through the driver's side window, spraying a cloud of green safety glass across the slush. But Garrett was already up. He cleared his jacket with his left hand, his thumb throwing the safety off the Colt .45 in one fluid, terrifying second. He didn't fire 3 times, he fired once. The mechanic with the shotgun dropped into the dirt, the weapon clattering against the gravel as he clutched a clean hole through his thigh. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't fighting anymore. The femoral artery was intact, but the muscle group was destroyed. A professional shot, calculated to stop, not to erase. The remaining guard turned to run, but Garrett's barrel was already fixed on the center of his chest. "Drop it," Garrett said. His voice was lower than the engine's throb. Flat, cold. The kid dropped his gun so fast it bounced off his own boot. He held his hands up, his face white under the halogen bulb. Victor didn't run. He stood by the hopper car, his hands still in his pockets, his gold-rimmed glasses reflecting the white glare of the headlamps. He looked down at the mechanic bleeding in the dirt, then up at Garrett. "You're getting old, Garrett," Victor said, his voice trembling just enough to show the rust. "You should have killed him." "I don't need to kill him to keep him from working, Victor," Garrett said, walking over to where I stood, his eyes never leaving the old trum. He didn't check on me with words. He just reached out with his left hand, his fingers catching my bleeding wrist, pulling me gently behind the shield of his chest. "The feds are at the 51st Street gate. They've had a tracker on Webb's ledger since 9 o'clock this morning. If you're still in this yard when the clock strikes 12, you won't be negotiating for shipping docks. You'll be negotiating for a cell with a toilet that doesn't flush." The distant wail of federal sirens began to rise from the north, cutting through the sleet. Victor looked at the aluminum case on the hood of the car. He looked at his 2 men groaning in the dirt. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the labyrinth of dark hopper cars, his sensible New Balance shoes making no sound at all on the wet gravel. Garrett didn't follow him. He turned to me, his face pale, his gray eyes looking down at my bloody hand. "Chloe," I said, my voice cracking as the adrenaline finally began to drain away. She's in the back. He didn't answer. He just took his knife from his pocket, cut the remaining ropes from my waist, and led me toward the corrugated iron wall where my sister was waiting for the light. The safe house was a small, two-bedroom cottage in Michigan City, Indiana, 40 miles east of the state line. It sat at the end of a gravel road, hidden behind a thick screen of bare poplars and wild dune grass. Through the kitchen window, you could hear the low, rhythmic crash of the lake waves hitting the sand. It sounded like the city, but without the iron. Chloe was sleeping in the back room. We'd given her 2 milligrams of Ativan from the kit, ID smuggled out of the penthouse. And she'd gone under within 20 minutes, her young face finally losing that tight, pinched look of terror. She was alive, she was unbroken. The wolves hadn't touched her. I sat at the small Formica kitchen table, a white towel wrapped around my right palm. The bleeding had stopped, leaving a dark, crusted line across the meat of my thumb where the hemp had bitten through. Garrett sat across from me. He had stripped off his black wool sweater, leaving him in a white undershirt that was stained with a yellow streak of antiseptic near the shoulder. The medical patch ID applied 24 hours ago was peeling at the edges, gray with lint from his clothes. He had a small blue velvet box sitting on the table between us. It looked ridiculous next to the salt shaker and the bottle of generic aspirin. He pushed it toward me with one finger. Your father, S. Garrett said. I didn't open it, I knew what was inside. The silver wedding band, with the small scratch near the hallmark where he had caught it on a boiler pipe in 1994. Marcus Webb told the feds everything before they moved him to the safe location, I said, my voice flat, keeping time with the waves outside. He told them about Victor S. Ledger. He told them you gave them the digital encryption keys to the port accounts. I did, Garrett said. He leaned back in the wooden chair, his right shoulder dropping an inch as the torn muscle finally gave up its fight. He looked old in the dim light of the single bulb above the stove. The keys will give the Department of Justice enough metadata to freeze every asset Victor has from here to Montreal. He'll spend the next 10 years in a federal courthouse trying to prove his grandfather didn't steal the money from a collective farm. And you? I asked, my eyes lifting to his gray face. What does it do to your ledger? Garrett let out a dry, tired breath. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a loose cigarette, but didn't light it. He just turned it over in his long fingers, watching the tobacco flake onto the formica. It empties it, he said. When you hand the government the keys to a logistics network, you don't get to keep the corporate suite. Clara. Vance Holding Group will be in receivership by Monday morning. The legitimate real estate, the apartment buildings. The commercial lots will be sold off to pay the back taxes and the settlement fees. By the time the lawyers are done skinning the whale, there won't be enough left to buy a sandwich in the Loop. You gave it all away, I said, to save a nurse's sister. I gave it away to buy my life back, he said, looking straight into my eyes. His pale gray gaze was completely clear now, stripped of the calculated coldness he'd carried in the garage. Every empire has a shelf life. Clara, you think you're rebuilding something that lasts, but you just stacking stones on top of a swamp, eventually. The weight gets too heavy, and the whole thing starts to sink. A real leader knows when the ground is failing. He knows that if he doesn't pull his people off the mountain before the slide starts. He's not a protector. He's just a warden leading them into a ditch. He stood up, walking over to the small stove to check the kettle. His movements were slow, his right arm still tucked against his ribs to protect the rotator cuff. Danny called me from Bridgeport before the government lines went dark. Garrett said, his back turned to me. He said you saw the photo from September 14th. The towel around my hand suddenly felt heavy again. The memory of my father's small, neat handwriting on the back of that Polaroid came back, sharp as a needle. You were there, I said, with Victor. 3 weeks before my father died. I was there because I was trying to buy the warehouse before Victor could lay the concrete for his supply lines, Garrett said. He didn't turn around. He stood watching the blue flame beneath the kettle. Your father, he didn't just find a tap in the wall. Clara. He found the digital routing codes for the whole Southside grid. He was an old-school maintenance man. He knew how to read a schematic. He knew exactly what those wires were doing. He paused, the kettle starting to let out a low, whistling groan. He didn't go to the police first, Garrett whispered. He came to me. He walked into the lobby of Vance Tower on a Thursday afternoon, wearing his grease-stained work shirt, and he demanded to see the CEO. He sat in my leather chair, looked me right in the eye, and told me that, if I didn't pull the wires out of his basement, he'd take the schematics to the federal building on Dearborn Street. I clutched the towel closer to my palm, the tears finally starting to slide down my cheeks. Hot and silent. What did you tell him? I told him I'd take care of it, Garrett said. He turned around now, holding 2 mugs of black tea. He set one down in front of me, his hand steady despite the exhaustion lines around his mouth. I told him I'd move the line. And I meant it. But Victor's people had a leak in my compliance office. They knew your father had the codes. They didn't ask for permission, Clara. They didn't run a calculation. They just hit him with a stolen sedan on 18th Street, while I was still drafting the relocation agreement. He sat back down, his long fingers wrapping around his mug for warmth. I didn't tell you the truth in Danny S. house because I knew it would make the grief dirty, he said softly. I knew you'd look at me and see the wire that brought the knife to your father's throat. And you would have been right to see it. In my world, you don't get to clean your hands just because you didn't pull the trigger. Proximity is a confession. I looked down at the blue velvet box between us. I reached out with my left hand, my clean hand, and clicked the latch open. The silver band lay inside, dull under the yellow kitchen light. It didn't look like an artifact of a Mafia war. It just looked like my dad. A man who mended pipes, who didn't bow his head, and who had walked into the tallest building in the city to tell a billionaire to get out of his basement. He wasn't a zero, Garrett, I said, my voice thick with the salt of my tears. He wasn't just infrastructure. No, Garrett said, his gray eyes darkening with a sudden profound respect. He was the only honest man who ever sat in that executive office. Clara. He was the only one who didn't ask for a price. We sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a long time, the whistle of the kettle dying out, replaced by the endless, steady thump of the Indiana waves against the sand. We didn't touch. We didn't reach across the formica. But as the first pale light of a Hoosier dawn began to gray the poplar trees outside the window, I realized the nurse in me wasn't looking at a monster anymore. I was looking at a patient who had finally survived the surgery. He had cut out the tumor, and even though the scar was going to be ugly, the blood was running clean for the first time in 20 years. The morning sun over Beaufort, South Carolina, didn't have the sharp blue glare of the Chicago sky. It was soft. Diluted by the salt mist rising from the marshes, it turned the floorboards of the screened porch into a pale, warm amber. It was August. 1 year since the rain-slicked concrete of level B3. 1 year since the midnight ledger at track 14 had been balanced and closed. I stood by the screen door, holding 2 mugs of slow-brewed cinnamon coffee. The aroma was thick, blending with the sharp, sweet smell of green pine and tidal mud from the creek behind the house. Beneath the light cotton of my white sundress, my belly was a small round curve, 3 months. A secret we'd only shared with Chloe and the small-town doctor down on Bay Street, out in the yard. Beneath the sprawling arms of a live oak draped in Spanish moss, Garrett was working. He didn't have his tailored charcoal suits anymore. He wore a faded blue denim shirt, sleeves rolled past his forearms, and a pair of worn canvas work pants. His hair, which had only carried a few streaks of silver at the temples back in the loop, was entirely gray now. It made his face look softer, less like granite, more like wood that had been seasoned by a long winter. He was using a vintage wooden handplane to smooth the edge of a long plank of local heart pine. Shh, shh, shh. The rhythm was steady, deliberate. He'd spend 30 seconds pushing the tool, watching the thin, curled ribbons of aromatic wood shave off and flutter into the grass. Then he'd stop. He'd run his bare hand over the grain, his long fingers feeling for the micro-imperfections the eye couldn't register. His right shoulder didn't hitch anymore. The grade 2 tear had healed into a thick, functional knot of scar tissue. It was a limitation, yes, but he'd learned the new architecture of his joints. He moved with the wood, not against it. You're rushing the heel. A voice called out from the shade of the porch. Henry sat in a low wicker rocker, a glass of sweet tea resting on his knee. He was 74. A retired shipwright, with skin like old boot leather and a left hand that was missing the tips of 2 fingers from a run-in with a band, saw in 1978. He'd taken Garrett under his wing 3 months ago, mostly because Garrett was the only apprentice he'd ever met who didn't talk back when he told him his cuts were sloppy. "The wood isn't your enemy, son," Henry said, taking a slow sip of his tea. "You don't force a plank into compliance just because you have the muscle to bend it. If you don't respect the natural direction of the grain, the way the tree grew when it was fighting the wind, the wood will just wait until you turn your back. And then it'll warp and split, right at the seam." True craft isn't about dominance. It's about a conversation between your hand and the material. Garrett stopped the plane. He stood up straight, wiping his brow with the back of his forearm. He looked at the long plank, then turned his head toward the porch, his pale gray eyes finding mine through the copper screen. "A conversation," Garrett repeated, his voice dropping into that low, rhythmic rumble that used to rattle the windows of Vance Tower, but out here it sounded like the tide moving through the reeds. "That's a hard habit to break, Henry. I spent 20 years in a room where compliance was the only thing that kept the roof from falling." "Then you were in the wrong room," Henry said, swinging his feet down and standing up with a rusty groan. "I am heading down to the marina to check on the shrimp boat hulls. Leave that pine to sit in the shade for an hour before you glue the tongue. It needs to breathe." The old man walked down the gravel drive, his boots crunching rhythmically until the sound was swallowed by the cicadas in the marsh. Garrett walked up the wooden steps of the porch. He didn't wipe the sawdust from his arms. He liked the smell of it. He took one of the mugs from my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. His skin was rougher now, lined with tiny, clean cuts from the chisels, but the touch was incredibly gentle. "Chloe called while you were at the lumber yard," I said, leaning my back against the porch railing. "She passed her midterms at Charleston. Top 5% of her nursing class." Garrett took a slow sip of the coffee, looking out over the brown, grass-filled water of the inlet. A blue heron was standing perfectly still in the shallows, waiting for a minnow. "She has your focus," he said softly. "She knows how to look at a storm and see the structure. She knows how to survive," I corrected, reaching out to touch the heavy silver ring hanging from a chain around my neck, my father's ring. "We both learned that from the same maintenance man." Garrett set his mug down on the cedar side table. He stepped closer, his large frame blocking out the heat of the midday sun, his hands coming down to rest flat on the railing on either side of my hips. He didn't press his weight against me the way he had behind the black SUV in level B3. He just stood there, a solid wall of cedar wood and clean sweat, creating a small shaded harbor for me in the middle of the southern afternoon. "The federal compliance officer signed off on the final receivership audit yesterday," Garrett said, his voice dropping into that quiet, absolute register. "The Loop properties are completely liquidated. The logistics network has been integrated into the regional port authority system. It's over, Clara. Every line item is down to zero." I looked at his face at the small white scar on his goma, right where Victor S. mechanic had sprayed the window glass. At the deep lines around his eyes that had come from 12 months of federal depositions and forensic accountants stripping away his family's name. "Are you sorry?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the hum of the cicadas. "You built that whole kingdom, Garrett. You spent your youth standing in the gap so nobody else would get crushed." Garrett looked down at his calloused palms, turning them over in the amber light. He looked at the grain of his own skin. "I didn't build a kingdom, Clara," he said, his voice carrying the deep weight of a man who had finally finished his penance. "I built a cage with better plumbing. I thought I was protecting Danny. I thought I was protecting the city. But protection that requires you to carry an iron weapon in your coat pocket every single night isn't security. It's just a hostage situation where you're the one holding the keys. True freedom isn't the power to dictate terms to other men. It's the right to walk into a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon and buy a piece of pine because you want to build a table that will outlive you." It took me 41 years to learn that a man's dignity is measured by what he creates with his hands, not what he can take with his fist. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine for 3 long, quiet seconds. Under his shirt, against my collarbone, I could hear his heart rate steady, rhythmic, 70 beats a minute. The pulse of an ordinary man who was no longer waiting for a train that was late. He dropped his left hand to my waist, his palm spreading flat over the small, warm curve of my sundress. His thumb moved in a slow, circular motion, a tiny, invisible gesture of possession that had nothing to do with contracts or ledgers. Mine, he whispered. The word was the same one he'd used in the dark of that concrete basement at 2.17 in the morning. But the color of it had changed completely. It wasn't a threat anymore. It wasn't the sound of an iron gate locking a witness into his world. It was a promise. A declaration of alignment. He was telling the marsh, the sky, and the child growing inside me that he had finally found his square foot of dirt, and he was ready to defend it with nothing but his bare hands. Yes, I said, my fingers closing over his wrist, feeling the strong, clean leap of his pulse beneath the skin. Yours. We stood on the screened porch, as the afternoon began to lean toward evening. The shadows of the live oaks stretching long and blue across the salt grass. Down in the creek, the blue heron finally struck, its beak coming up with a small silver flash before it took flight, its massive wings beating the humid air with a slow, heavy rhythm as it headed toward the open sea. Outside, the long plank of heart pine sat in the shade beneath the oak tree, its fresh-cut surface catching the last golden rays of the South Carolina sun. The wood was breathing. The grain was settling into its new alignment. And for the first time since the winter rain had hit the glass of the Vance Tower penthouse, the silence in the room wasn't an ambush. It was just the beginning of the story. The author does not encourage or promote dangerous actions, illegal behavior, discrimination, or harmful conduct depicted in this story. Any conflicts, confrontations, or controversial themes shown are fictional elements designed to support the dramatic structure of the narrative.
Clara entered his world as a nurse, not a soldier. She did not have an army, a fortune, or a family name that made men step aside. What she had was something far more dangerous to men like Victor, a clear understanding of human dignity. She understood that a person is never a zero in someone else's calculation. Her father was not infrastructure. Chloe was not leverage. Dr. Webb's son was not a bargaining chip. Every human being in this story carried a value that no ledger, no port authority, no criminal empire, and no corporate strategy had the right to erase. That is the moral line Clara refused to surrender. Her courage was not born from violence. It was born from responsibility. As an ER nurse, Clara knew what fear does to the body. She knew how panic spreads, how people break under pressure, and how easy it is to mistake survival for surrender. But when the moment came, she did not collapse. She cleared the hazard. She protected her sister. She told the truth about her father. She stood before men who saw people as assets and reminded them that life is not a transaction. That kind of courage is quiet, but it changes everything. Garrett's redemption did not happen because he defeated Victor in the rail yard. It happened because he finally understood the cost of the world he had built. He realized that a man cannot call himself a protector if the people around him only survive by living under his control. True protection does not remove someone's freedom. It gives them the strength, the truth, and the space to stand on their own. When Garrett gave up the keys, the companies, the properties, and the name that had defined him, he was not losing power. He was finally releasing himself from the hostage situation he had mistaken for leadership. This story also teaches us that guilt cannot be washed clean by good intentions alone. Garrett did not kill Clara's father, but he understood that proximity is a confession. In a broken system, silence can become cooperation. Distance can become permission. And when powerful people allow innocent people to be crushed because the larger calculation seems necessary, they still carry part of the weight. The only way Garrett could truly honor Clara's father was not by explaining the past, but by dismantling the machine that made such a death possible. Victor Sorkin represents the coldest kind of evil, the kind that does not rage, does not tremble, and does not even need to hate. He looked at Clara's father and saw a zero. He looked at Chloe and saw leverage. He looked at the city and saw only roots, assets, and profit. But the story reminds us that when a man removes humanity from his calculations, he eventually removes the foundation beneath his own feet. A system that treats people as disposable will always collapse because every erased life leaves a hole, and eventually those holes become too many to hide. And then there is the ending. Not in a penthouse, not in a warehouse, not beneath the cold lights of a rail yard, but on a screened porch in Beaufort. Garrett is no longer the boss. He is a man learning how to work with wood, how to respect the grain, how to build without forcing things into submission. That image matters. It shows us that healing is not a dramatic speech or one final act of sacrifice. Healing is repetition. It is patience. It is learning a new rhythm. It is putting down the weapon and picking up a tool. It is discovering that creation requires more strength than domination ever did. Clara's ending matters just as much. She does not become a reward for Garrett's redemption. She remains herself, a nurse, a protector, a woman shaped by grief, but not owned by it. She carries her father's ring close to her heart, not as a symbol of pain, but as a reminder that ordinary people can have extraordinary moral weight. Her father walked into a tower and told a billionaire to get out of his basement. That courage lives in Clara. It lives in Chloe. And now, it lives in the new life growing quietly beneath the South Carolina sun. The meaning of this story is clear. Dignity cannot be bought, erased, traded, or calculated away. Love is not control. Safety is not captivity. Power is not the ability to take, but the courage to let go when holding on begins to harm the people you claim to protect.